The November rain fell cold and gray over the Berkshire Mountains, when Helena Winterbourne first understood that her father had left her nothing but debt and dying patients. She stood in the drafty office of the Winterbourne Sanitarium, 23 miles west of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, reviewing the account books by lamplight. Outside, fog crept through the pine forests that surrounded the three-story brick building like a fortress wall. Her father, Dr. Edmund Winterbourne, had died of a heart seizure on October 12, 1892, collapsing in this very office while writing a patient report. Helena had arrived from Vienna 3 weeks later, crossing the Atlantic with her medical degree and her few possessions, expecting to find a thriving medical facility. Instead, she found a crumbling institution $47,000 in debt, housing 47 tubercular patients who could barely pay for their care. The sanitarium had been built in 1878, when the mountain air cure was considered the most effective treatment for consumption. Edmund Winterbourne had purchased 340 acres of mountain land, constructed the main building, and established a facility for working-class patients who couldn't afford the expensive private sanitariums in the Adirondacks or Colorado. For a decade, it had been moderately successful. Then came the Depression of 1884, the rise of competing facilities, and Edmund's increasingly erratic financial decisions. Helena was 34 years old, unmarried, and possessed a medical degree from the University of Vienna that most American institutions refused to recognize because she was a woman. She had studied under some of Europe's leading tuberculosis researchers, learning bacteriology, pathology, and the new theories about disease transmission. She had returned to America expecting to work alongside her father to bring modern scientific methods to his facility. Now she was the owner of a failing sanitarium, legally responsible for its debts and its patients. The attorney, a thin man named Horace Pembroke, had laid out her options with bureaucratic precision. Sell the property and use the proceeds to pay creditors, leaving her perhaps $3,000 to live on, or attempt to operate the facility, knowing that current patient fees would never cover operating costs, and watch the debt grow until foreclosure became inevitable. Neither option was acceptable. Helena spent the first week after her father's funeral touring the facility, examining patients, reviewing medical records. The sanitarium could house 80 patients across 3 floors. Currently, only 47 beds were occupied. The building itself was solid brick, heated by a coal furnace that consumed enormous amounts of fuel. The grounds included a staff cottage housing the 3 nurses, a laundry building, a kitchen house, and a small cemetery on the eastern edge of the property where 17 former patients lay buried. The patients were primarily immigrant workers from the textile mills in Pittsfield and North Adams. Italians, Irish, Polish, a handful of French Canadians. They came to Winterbourne because it was cheap, charging $4 per week when other sanitariums demanded $15 or $20. Most could barely afford even that reduced rate. Some paid in labor, working in the sanitarium's vegetable garden or laundry when their health permitted. Helena observed them with clinical detachment. They rested on the open-air sleeping porches her father had constructed, wrapped in blankets despite the November cold, breathing the supposedly curative mountain air. Some would recover. Most would not. Tuberculosis killed with methodical efficiency, destroying lung tissue, causing hemorrhaging, wasting the body until death came as almost a relief. On her 8th day at Winterbourne, Helena discovered her father's private journals. They were hidden in a locked drawer of his desk, beneath a false bottom that Helena found only by accident when the drawer jammed. 6 leather-bound volumes, spanning 1881 to 1892, filled with her father's precise handwriting. The early volumes contained standard medical observations, patient symptoms, treatment protocols, recovery rates. But around 1885, the entries began to change. Edmund had started noticing patterns in which patients recovered and which succumbed. He observed that tuberculosis seemed to run in families, that certain bloodlines showed remarkable resistance while others were devastated. He began recording family histories, tracing patient genealogies, documenting which nationalities and which family lines showed better survival rates. By 1888, Edmund was no longer simply observing. He was experimenting. Helena read the entries with growing fascination. Her father had begun deliberately exposing family members of recovered patients to tuberculosis, testing whether immunity was hereditary. He would house healthy relatives in rooms with advanced cases, monitoring whether they contracted the disease. He recorded the results in careful tables. Survival rates by nationality, survival rates by family line, survival rates by age of first exposure. The final journal, dated 1892, contained Edmund's conclusions. Tuberculosis resistance was hereditary. Certain families possessed some inherent factor that allowed them to survive infection. If these families could be identified and studied across multiple generations, if their resistant offspring could be tracked and observed, medical science might discover the mechanism of immunity itself. But Edmund had run out of time. His heart had failed before he could publish his research, before he could prove his theories. The journal's final entry, written the day before his death, read simply, "The work must continue. Future generations depend upon it." Helena sat alone in the office, reading her father's journals by lamplight. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows. She read each volume twice, absorbing not just the content, but the methodology, the evolution of her father's thinking. By dawn, she understood what needed to be done. The financial crisis that had seemed insurmountable the previous week now appeared almost irrelevant. Money was merely a tool. The real question was whether she had the will to continue Edmund's work, to expand it beyond his cautious experiments into something comprehensive and scientifically rigorous. She spent the next 3 days planning, not in her father's journals, but in a new leather-bound volume she purchased in Pittsfield during a supply run. She developed a coding system more sophisticated than Edmund's simple abbreviations. Patients became subjects with alphanumeric designations. Tuberculosis exposure became Protocol A. Pregnancy became cultivation. Birth became yield. Recovery became resistance confirmation. Death became negative outcome. The language sanitized the reality, which was precisely its purpose. Helena needed emotional distance to conduct proper research. Sentiment would only interfere with scientific objectivity. She began by identifying candidates. Young patients showing recovery, with no strong family connections pulling them away from the sanitarium. People who had nowhere else to go, who would accept extended residency if properly managed. The first subject was a young woman named Maria Castellano. Maria had been admitted to Winterbourne in September 1892, 3 weeks before Edmund's death. She was 22 years old, an Italian immigrant who had worked in the North Adams textile mills until a persistent cough and bloody sputum had forced her to seek treatment. She had no family in America. Her parents and siblings remained in a village outside Naples. She sent them money when she could, though tuberculosis treatment had consumed most of her savings. Helena examined Maria on December 3, 1892. The young woman's lungs showed improvement. Her cough had diminished significantly. Her color was better. Under normal protocols, she would be discharged within another month. Helena made a note in her new journal. Subject A1, female, age 22, Italian. Pulmonary TB, early stage, responding to treatment. No local family connections. Good candidate for extended observation. That afternoon, Helena sat with Maria in the common room. The space was drafty, heated by a single wood stove that did little to combat the December cold. Maria wore a donated wool shawl over her thin dress. Her hands were rough from mill work, her face gaunt from months of illness. Helena spoke gently, with practiced concern. "Your lungs are improving, Maria. That's good news. But I'm concerned about premature discharge. Tuberculosis is deceptive. Patients often feel better before they're fully recovered, and leaving treatment too early risks serious relapse." Maria nodded slowly. She had seen other patients relapse, had watched them return to the sanitarium months after discharge, sicker than before. How much longer? She asked. Her English was accented but clear. Several months at least. Perhaps longer. We'll monitor your progress carefully. I want to be absolutely certain before releasing you. But the cost? I have no more savings. We can arrange reduced fees in exchange for light work. Laundry, kitchen help, whatever your health permits. Would that be acceptable? Maria's relief was visible. Yes. Thank you, Doctor. Helena made another note in her journal that evening. Subject A1 agrees to extended residency. Will assign light duties to offset fees. Monitor for continued recovery and resistance confirmation. Over the next 2 months, Helena identified 7 more subjects. Giuseppe Rossi, a young man of 24 who had recovered from a moderate case of tuberculosis. Anna Kowalski, 19, Polish, nearly recovered after 4 months of treatment. Thomas O'Brien, 26, Irish, showing strong resistance despite documented exposure to infectious patients. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. Expressions of concern about premature discharge. Offers of extended care at reduced cost in exchange for labor. Appeals to patients' fears of relapse and their lack of alternatives. All of them stayed. By February 1893, Helena had established her core population. 8 young patients, 4 male and 4 female, all showing tuberculosis resistance, all agreeing to remain at Winterbourne indefinitely. The next phase required more delicate management. Helena needed these subjects to form families, to produce children who could be studied from birth. But she couldn't simply order them to marry and reproduce. They needed to believe the pairings were natural, voluntary, their own choices. She began by assigning compatible subjects to work together. Maria Castellano and Giuseppe Rossi were both Italian, both in their early 20s, both isolated from their original communities by distance and illness. Helena assigned them to laundry duties, creating daily opportunities for interaction. She did the same with the other subjects. Anna Kowalski and Thomas O'Brien both had morning kitchen duties. 2 other subjects, both French-Canadian, were assigned to garden work together. Helena observed the developing relationships with clinical interest. Humans were social creatures. Isolated from broader society, confined to a small community, they would naturally form attachments. She was simply directing those attachments toward scientifically useful outcomes. Maria and Giuseppe's relationship developed quickly. By April, they were sitting together at meals, taking walks together on the sanitarium grounds. By May, Giuseppe had asked Helena's permission to court Maria formally. Helena granted permission with appropriate gravity, as though she were Maria's guardian rather than her physician and jailer. In June, Giuseppe proposed. Maria accepted. They came to Helena asking about marriage, about starting a family, about building a life together at Winterbourne, where they both felt safe from the dangerous outside world. Helena's journal entry that evening was succinct. Subject A1 and Subject A2 pair bond established. Marriage anticipated within 2 months. Conception probability high. First-generation study population foundation proceeding as projected. The wedding took place on July 15, 1893, in the sanitarium's common room. Helena performed the ceremony herself, reading from a prayer book she had found in her father's belongings. She had no legal authority to conduct marriages, but neither Maria nor Giuseppe knew that. They believed themselves married under God and law. The ceremony was simple. 2 of the nurses attended as witnesses. Several other patients watched from the doorway. Maria wore a dress donated by one of the nurses. Giuseppe wore his only suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. When Helena pronounced them man and wife, Maria cried. Giuseppe's hands shook as he slipped a thin brass ring onto Maria's finger. They kissed awkwardly, self-consciously, while the small audience applauded. Helena felt nothing watching them except satisfaction that her plan was progressing. These people believed they were beginning a new life together. In reality, they were becoming experimental subjects in a study that would span generations. Maria and Giuseppe were given a private room on the 2nd floor, a small space with a double bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the pine forest. It was better accommodation than either had known in years. They were grateful. Helena monitored Maria carefully over the following months. She checked for signs of pregnancy weekly, documenting Maria's menstrual cycles, noting changes in appetite and energy. By September, Maria's courses had stopped. By October, she was experiencing morning nausea. By November, her abdomen was visibly swelling. Helena's journal entry on November 12, 1893. Subject A. 1 conception confirmed. Estimated delivery late May 1894. Both parents demonstrate tuberculosis resistance. Offspring will be monitored from birth for inherited resistance factors. First-generation study subject anticipated. Maria's pregnancy brought complications Helena had anticipated. As Maria's belly grew, she began talking about leaving Winterbourne after the baby's birth, about finding work in Pittsfield, or perhaps saving enough to return to Italy with her new family. Helena needed to prevent that without arousing suspicion or resistance. She began during one of Maria's examinations in December. Maria lay on the examination table while Helena palpated her abdomen, measuring the baby's growth. "The child is developing well," Helena said. "But Maria, I need to discuss something important with you." Maria tensed slightly. "Is something wrong?" "Not wrong, but concerning. You've recovered from tuberculosis, but that doesn't mean you're immune. And newborns are especially vulnerable to infection. Even parents who seem healthy can carry tuberculosis bacteria and transmit them to their infants." Maria's hand moved protectively to her belly. "What should I do?" "The safest option is to remain here at Winterbourne for the first year of the baby's life, perhaps longer. Here we can monitor both of you constantly. If any signs of infection appear, we can treat them immediately. Out there in Pittsfield or in crowded city conditions, your baby would be exposed to countless diseases with no medical supervision." The fear in Maria's eyes was exactly what Helena needed to see. "But the cost," Maria whispered. "We cannot afford." "Your work will cover the cost. And Giuseppe's work. You'll raise your child here, in clean mountain air, with medical care always available. Isn't that worth more than taking him out into a dangerous world?" Maria was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Yes, you are right, Doctor. We will stay." Helena made a note in her journal that evening. Subject A. 1 agrees to post-birth residency. Subjects increasingly dependent on facility. Control mechanisms effective. Over the winter of 1893 to 1894, Helena arranged 2 more marriages. Anna Kowalski and Thomas O'Brien were married in January. Another pair, the French-Canadians, were married in February. Both couples were housed in private rooms. Both women were pregnant by March. The sanitarium's nurse, Catherine Morris, began expressing concern around this time. Catherine was 41 years old, a widow who had worked at Winterbourne for 6 years. She was competent and observant. Too observant. One afternoon in March, she came to Helena's office with a question that made Helena's jaw tighten. "Dr. Winterbourne, I've been reviewing the patient records. We have 8 residents who've shown full recovery for months now, some for nearly a year. Standard protocol would be to discharge them, but they're all still here, and now 3 of them are pregnant. What's the medical justification for retaining recovered patients?" Helena looked up from her paperwork, her expression calm. "They're here voluntarily, Catherine. They've chosen to remain because they understand the risks of premature discharge. But they're not sick anymore. They're healthy people living in a tuberculosis sanitarium. That's not standard practice. I'm conducting a long-term study of tuberculosis resistance and recovery patterns. These patients have agreed to participate in exchange for continued care and housing. It's perfectly ethical." Catherine's expression suggested she disagreed, but she said nothing more. She left the office, but Helena saw the doubt in her eyes. Over the following weeks, Helena noticed Catherine paying closer attention to the permanent residents, asking them questions, reviewing their files more carefully. The nurse was becoming a problem. But before Helena could decide how to handle Catherine, Maria went into labor. It happened on the night of May 24, 1894. 3 weeks earlier than Helena had calculated. Maria's water broke just after midnight. Giuseppe ran through the halls shouting for help, panicked and terrified. Helena arrived within minutes, still dressed in her nightgown with a robe thrown over it. Catherine was already with Maria, timing contractions, preparing the delivery room. The labor lasted 14 hours. Maria screamed through most of it, her voice echoing through the second floor. Giuseppe waited outside the room, pacing and praying in Italian. Helena monitored every stage of the delivery with clinical precision. She noted the time between contractions. She measured dilation. She documented everything in her mind for later transcription to her journal. The baby crowned at 2:17 p.m. Helena guided the head through, cleared the infant's airways, delivered the shoulders and body in a rush of blood and fluid. A boy. Small but healthy, with a strong cry that filled the room. Helena cut the cord, cleaned the infant, and performed her initial examination. 7 pounds even. Good color, strong heartbeat. No obvious deformities. Lungs clear. She wrapped the baby in a clean blanket and handed him to Maria, who was crying and laughing simultaneously, reaching for her son with shaking hands. Giuseppe was allowed into the room. He stood by the bed, staring at his son with an expression of wonder that made him look much younger than his 25 years. Helena watched them for a moment. This little family, united in joy over a new life. Then she returned to her office and opened her journal. May 24th, 1894. Subject A1 delivered male infant at 2:17 p.m., weight 7 pounds, no complications. Subject A1 a viable and healthy. First-generation study subject acquired. Will monitor for tuberculosis resistance from birth. Both parents demonstrate resistance. Hypothesis: offspring will show inherited immunity. She designated the baby as Subject A1A in her records. In the official birth registry, he was recorded as Antonio Rossi, born to Maria and Giuseppe Rossi, residents of Winterbourne Sanitarium. Maria recovered quickly from the delivery. Within a week, she was walking the halls with Antonio wrapped in her arms, showing him to the other patients, glowing with maternal pride. Helena allowed this for 2 weeks. Then she began the next phase. Antonio was moved from Maria's room to a small nursery Helena had established in a converted storage space on the 2nd floor. Maria was allowed to visit for feeding and basic care, but the baby would sleep in the nursery under Helena's direct supervision. Maria protested. "I want him with me. I am his mother. And as his mother, you want what's best for him. The nursery is warmer and better ventilated than your room. I can monitor him through the night for any signs of illness. This is for his protection, Maria." Maria's resistance crumbled under the weight of her own fears. If Dr. Winterbourne said it was safer, it must be safer. She agreed. Helena established a routine. Maria would bring Antonio to the nursery each evening at 8. Helena or one of the nurses would care for him through the night. Maria would retrieve him each morning at 6 for feeding and daily care. But during those night hours, Helena conducted her observations. She measured Antonio's growth daily. She listened to his lungs. She examined his skin, his eyes, his reflexes. She documented everything in her journal. And when Antonio was 6 weeks old, Helena began Protocol A. She had Giuseppe spend 30 minutes in a room with a patient who had active infectious tuberculosis. Not long enough for certain transmission, but enough for potential exposure. Then she had Giuseppe return to his normal quarters, spend time with Maria and the baby, creating a potential infection chain. She documented the date, the duration of exposure, the patient Giuseppe had been near. Then she waited. Over the next 2 weeks, Helena monitored all 3 family members obsessively. Giuseppe developed a slight cough on day 9. Helena isolated him immediately, performed sputum tests, examined his lungs daily. The cough resolved within a week. The sputum tests showed no tuberculosis bacteria. Giuseppe had been exposed but had not contracted active disease. Maria and Antonio showed no symptoms at all. Helena's journal entry on July 15th, 1894. Protocol A. Subject A-2 exposure. Negative outcome. No disease transmission to Subject A2 or Subject A1A. Resistance appears to hold across family unit. Hypothesis supported. She continued the observations through the summer. Antonio grew normally, meeting all developmental milestones. He smiled at 8 weeks, rolled over at 12 weeks, laughed at 16 weeks. Helena documented all of it alongside her disease resistance data. By August, Anna Kowalski had delivered a daughter. By September, the French-Canadian couple had delivered twin boys. Helena now had 4 first-generation subjects. 4 healthy infants born to parents who had recovered from tuberculosis. She established the same protocols for all of them. Nursery care under her supervision, careful monitoring, controlled exposure to tuberculosis through family members who spent time near infectious patients. The summer of 1894 passed in a rhythm of observation and documentation. Helena spent hours in the nursery, watching the infants sleep, measuring their growth, listening to their breathing. She felt no attachment to them. They were data points, experimental subjects, tools for understanding disease resistance. But she felt satisfaction. The research was progressing exactly as planned. Catherine Morris watched all of this with growing unease. She saw how Dr. Winterbourne had taken control of the infants, how she monitored them constantly, how she sometimes moved the married men between different patient rooms for reasons Catherine couldn't understand. She saw how the permanent residents never left, how their number was slowly growing, how Dr. Winterbourne seemed to be building some kind of closed community within the sanitarium. Catherine had worked in medical facilities for 20 years. She had never seen anything like this. One evening in September, Catherine entered the nursery to check on the infants and found Dr. Winterbourne alone with them. All 4 babies were sleeping in their cribs. Dr. Winterbourne stood in the center of the room, holding a leather journal, writing by lamplight. Catherine saw the journal's pages covered in symbols and abbreviations she didn't recognize. Not standard medical notation. Something else. Something coded. Dr. Winterbourne looked up, her eyes flat and cold in the lamplight. "Yes, Catherine? I was just checking on the babies. They're fine. You may go." Catherine left, but the image of Dr. Winterbourne standing among those sleeping infants, writing in her coded journal, stayed with her. That night, Catherine began her own documentation. She started a private notebook, recording her observations, patients who stayed despite recovery, controlled room assignments she didn't understand, the coded journal, the obsessive monitoring of the infants. She didn't know what Dr. Winterbourne was doing, but she knew it was wrong, and she knew she needed evidence before she could act. Catherine began copying patient records when Dr. Winterbourne was away from the office. Just a few pages at a time, enough to avoid detection. She smuggled the copies to her cottage, hiding them in a locked trunk beneath her bed. She was building a case. She just needed more time. Helena, meanwhile, was planning years into the future. She sat in her office on a cold October evening, drawing charts in her journal. Family trees that didn't show actual families, but projected pairings for children who were barely 6 months old. When these children reached 16, Helena would arrange their marriages. Subject A1A would be paired with Subject B1A. Subject C1 would be paired with Subject A2A. The second generation would be born from parents who both demonstrated tuberculosis resistance. That second generation would prove everything. If both parents showed resistance and their children showed even higher resistance rates, it would confirm the hereditary mechanism beyond any doubt. Helena would need to keep these children at Winterbourne their entire lives. They would be raised in the sanitarium, educated there, married there, bearing their own children there. A completely controlled population spanning multiple generations. It would take decades, but Helena was only 36 years old. She had time. She drew her charts, made her calculations, planned futures for children who had no choice in their own destinies. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the Berkshire Mountains in white silence. Inside the nursery, 4 infants slept, unaware they had been born into an experiment that would consume their entire lives. Maria Rossi sat by the window in her room, watching the snow fall, holding her son Antonio against her chest. She hummed an Italian lullaby her own mother had sung to her years ago in a village she would never sigh again. She believed her son was safe here. She believed Dr. Winterbourne was protecting them. She believed everything would be all right. She had no idea what was planned for Antonio, what his future held, what Dr. Winterbourne saw when she looked at him. She had no idea that her son was not a child to the woman who controlled their lives. He was Subject A1, a first-generation experimental subject, data point in a study that had only just begun. And in her cottage beyond the main building, Catherine Morris sat at her small desk, writing in her hidden notebook by candlelight, documenting everything she had seen, building evidence against a woman she was only beginning to understand was capable of monstrous things. The snow fell heavier. Winter was coming to Winterbourne Sanitarium, and with it, horrors that none of them could yet imagine. The spring of 1895 brought warmth to the Berkshire Mountains, but no warmth reached the 3rd floor of Winterbourne Sanitarium, where Catherine Morris discovered what had become of the children. She found them by accident on a Tuesday morning in late April. Dr. Winterbourne had taken the carriage to Pittsfield for medical supplies, a trip that would occupy most of the day. Catherine had been tasked with inventory in the storage rooms on the 3rd floor, a section of the building rarely used since most patients occupied the lower floors. The 3rd floor was colder than the rest of the building. Most of the rooms stood empty, doors open to reveal bare floors and stripped beds. But one section of the hallway was different. 4 doors were closed, and Catherine could hear sounds behind them, children's voices, movement, the shuffle of small feet. Catherine approached the first door slowly. It had a new lock installed, brass and solid. She tried the handle. Locked. Through the door, she heard a child crying. Not the wail of an infant, but the sustained sobbing of a young child, perhaps 2 or 3 years old. She knocked gently. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by deliberate silence. "Hello, are you all right in there?" No response. She moved to the second door, also locked. She pressed her ear against the wood and heard breathing. Multiple people, children and at least one adult. Catherine knocked harder on the first door. "This is Nurse Morris. I need to know who's in there." A long pause, then a woman's voice, heavily accented. "Italian. We are fine. Please go away." Catherine recognized the voice. Maria Rossi. "Maria? Why are you locked in? Where is Antonio?" "Please, Nurse Morris, you must go. Dr. Winterbourne says no one comes to 3rd floor. You will make trouble for us. I'm not leaving until you open this door." Silence. Then the sound of a lock turning. The door opened 6 inches. Maria's face appeared in the gap, pale and thin, her eyes sunken. Behind her, Catherine could see a room converted into living quarters. 4 small beds, a table with chairs, shelves holding toys and books, and children, 3 of them, toddlers between 1 and 3 years old, sitting on the floor, staring at Catherine with wide, silent eyes. "Maria, what is this?" Maria's hand gripped the door frame, knuckles white. "This is where we live now. Dr. Winterbourne says it is safer. The children must stay away from the sick patients below. But you're locked in. For safety. So the children do not wander." Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach. She recognized one of the toddlers, Antonio, now 11 months old. But there were 2 other children she didn't recognize. Who are these other children? Maria's eyes filled with tears. Anna's daughter and Lisette's son. We care for them together. Dr. Winterbourne says it is better this way. The mothers come for feeding, but the children stay here. Always here. How long have you been locked in this room? Maria looked down. Since January. 4 months now. Catherine stepped back from the door. Maria, I'm going to help you. Please, no. Maria's voice was desperate. Please, you must not interfere. Dr. Winterbourne says if anyone tries to take the children away, she will send us all away. She will separate us. I will never see Antonio again. Please, Nurse Morris, please just leave us alone. I can't do that. Then you will destroy us. Maria closed the door. Catherine heard the lock turn. Catherine stood in the hallway, her heart pounding. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Heavy, adult, moving quickly. She turned and saw Dr. Winterbourne at the far end of the hallway, still wearing her traveling coat, her face expressionless. What are you doing up here, Catherine? Catherine straightened, forcing herself to remain calm. I was doing inventory and heard children. I wanted to make sure they were all right. Dr. Winterbourne walked toward her slowly, deliberately. The children are perfectly well. They're being housed in a controlled environment to protect them from tubercular exposure. Their mothers visit regularly. It's a sensible medical precaution. They're locked in rooms, isolated. That's not medical care. That's imprisonment. Dr. Winterbourne's eyes went cold. You're overstepping your authority, Catherine. These are my patients, my facility, my decisions. Your methods are wrong. Those women and children should not be locked away like criminals. Would you prefer I expose newborns to active tuberculosis? Either controlled isolation or deadly infection. Which do you prefer? There are other alternatives. Discharge them. Let them leave. They don't want to leave. They've agreed to stay. This is voluntary. Voluntary? They're terrified you'll separate them from their children. That's coercion. Dr. Winterbourne stepped closer. I'm going to give you a choice, Catherine. You can accept that what I'm doing here is medically necessary. You can continue your work and say nothing about the third floor to anyone. Or you can make this into a conflict, in which case I will terminate your employment and ensure you never work in medicine again. Which do you choose? Catherine's hands trembled. She thought of the documentation she'd been gathering, the copied records hidden in her cottage. She wasn't ready. She didn't have enough evidence. She needed more time. I understand, Dr. Winterbourne. I apologize for overstepping. Dr. Winterbourne studied her face. Good. You will not come to the third floor again unless I specifically instruct you to do so. Is that clear? Yes, Doctor. That evening, Catherine returned to her cottage and added new entries to her hidden documentation. 4 rooms on third floor, all locked. Mothers and children isolated. Estimated 8 to 12 people imprisoned. Mothers too frightened to resist. She needed help. Someone with authority to investigate. She decided to write to the State Medical Board in Boston, a formal letter detailing her concerns, supported by documentation. She began drafting the letter that night, working by candlelight, choosing her words carefully. Helena Winterbourne, meanwhile, locked herself in her office and opened her journal. April 23, 1895. Nurse Morris discovered third-floor housing. Situation contained but represents ongoing security risk. Must monitor Morris carefully. Catherine Morris knew too much. Even if she stayed quiet now, she remained a threat. Eventually, her conscience would overcome her caution. Helena would wait, watch, and when the moment was right, Catherine Morris would cease to be an obstacle. The summer of 1895 brought new complications. Giuseppe Rossi began showing signs of severe depression. He had been separated from Maria and Antonio for months, living in a small room on the second floor while his family was imprisoned above. He stopped eating regularly. The other permanent residents noticed his deterioration. Helena summoned him to her office in early June. Giuseppe sat across from her, eyes fixed on the floor. He had lost weight. His skin had a grayish pallor. You're not well, Giuseppe. What's troubling you? He said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, I want to see my family. I want to live with my wife and son. This separation is killing me. The separation is temporary. Once Antonio is older, you'll be reunited. When? Another year. Perhaps 2. Giuseppe's hands clenched into fists. I cannot endure this. Please, doctor, please let me be with them. Helena considered. Giuseppe's deteriorating condition was problematic. If he became too depressed, he might attempt suicide, which would disrupt her research. I'll allow you to move to the third floor. You can live with Maria and Antonio. But there are strict conditions. You will maintain absolute silence during daylight hours. You will follow all my instructions without question. If you agree, I'll move you tomorrow." Giuseppe's relief was immediate. "Yes, I agree. Thank you, doctor." Helena made a note in her journal that evening. Subject A2 relocated to third-floor housing. Family unit reunited to prevent psychological deterioration. Giuseppe was moved the next day. The reunion was emotional. Maria wept. Giuseppe held his son for the first time in months, his shoulders shaking. Helena watched for a moment, then locked the door and left them. Over the following weeks, she relocated the other fathers to the third floor as well. Each family was confined to a single room. 4 rooms, 4 families, 12 adults and 7 children. The third floor became a hidden prison. The families developed routines. They woke before dawn and spoke in whispers. Children were taught from infancy to remain quiet. When babies cried, mothers would smother the sound against their bodies, rocking frantically, terrified. Helena visited daily, bringing meals, conducting examinations, monitoring the children's development. She continued her tuberculosis resistance protocols. One adult would spend time near an infectious patient on the lower floors, then return to the third-floor room, creating exposure without obvious experimentation. Most of the children remained healthy. One infant developed symptoms in July and died in August. Helena documented it clinically. Subject D-1B, negative outcome at 4 months. Parents both show resistance. Offspring did not inherit factor. The child's parents, Lisette and Jean-Paul, were devastated. Lisette held her dead baby for hours, refusing to let Helena take the body. Helena had the body removed eventually, buried in the unmarked section of the cemetery. She made notes about which genetic lines were producing viable offspring and which were not. By autumn 1895, Catherine Morris had completed her letter to the State Medical Board. 5 pages, meticulously detailed, describing the locked third floor, the imprisoned families, the coded journals. She included copies of patient records showing people officially discharged who were actually still at Winterbourne. In late October, Dr. Winterbourne traveled to Springfield for a medical conference. Catherine took the carriage to Pittsfield and posted her letter at the Central Post Office, paying for certified delivery. Then she returned to Winterbourne and waited. The response came 6 weeks later. A letter arrived from the Massachusetts Board of Registration in Medicine. It referenced a complaint regarding patient care practices. The board requested Dr. Winterbourne's written response within 30 days. If unsatisfactory, an official inspection would be conducted. Helena read the letter 3 times, expressionless. Then she summoned Catherine to her office. Catherine entered, heart hammering. She saw the letter on the desk. "Someone has filed a complaint against me with the State Medical Board. Do you know anything about this?" Catherine had rehearsed this moment dozens of times. She met Dr. Winterbourne's eyes and lied. "No, doctor, I know nothing about it. The complaint mentions locked rooms on the third floor, exactly what you discovered 6 months ago. Are you certain you had no role in this? I swear, I said nothing to anyone." Helena studied Catherine's face. "I believe you, which means someone else has been observing. I need you to help me identify who might have sent this complaint." "Of course, doctor." Catherine left the office, hands shaking. She had passed the first test, but the real challenge was coming. When investigators arrived, they would discover the third floor. They would free the families. Catherine allowed herself to feel hope. But Helena had no intention of allowing investigators to find evidence. Over the next 2 weeks, she systematically eliminated the problems. She moved the families from the third floor in the middle of the night, transporting them in a covered wagon to a property she had quietly purchased over the summer, a small farmhouse 20 miles west of Pittsfield, far from any main roads. The families were told this was temporary, that they would return after renovations at Winterbourne. It was not temporary. The farmhouse became their new prison. Helena hired a man named Samuel Cobb to watch over it, a former mill worker who asked no questions. He was told the families were recovering tuberculosis patients who needed isolation. With the families hidden and the third floor sanitized, Helena composed her response to the medical board. She expressed shock at the allegations. She categorically denied imprisoning patients. She invited inspection at their convenience. The board's response arrived in January 1896. They would conduct a site visit in March. Helena spent 2 months preparing. She coached remaining patients. She reviewed every record for inconsistencies. She transformed Winterbourne into a model sanitarium. The inspection took place on March 12, 1896. 2 physicians from Boston arrived unannounced. They toured the facility, interviewed patients, examined records. They found nothing irregular. The third floor was empty and unused. Patient records showed normal operations. Current residents confirmed they were treated well and staying voluntarily. One physician, Dr. Harrison, interviewed Catherine privately. "Nurse Morris, are you aware of any inappropriate patient care practices at this facility?" Catherine's mouth went dry. This was her moment. She could tell them everything, but she had no proof. The families were gone. The third floor showed no evidence. Her documentation would be her word against Dr. Winterbourne's. If she spoke now without proof, she would be dismissed as unreliable. Dr. Winterbourne would know Catherine had filed the complaint. Catherine made a decision she would regret forever. "No, Dr. Harrison, I'm not aware of any problems." The inspectors departed that afternoon. Their report, filed 2 weeks later, found no evidence supporting the allegations. The complaint was closed. Helena read the report with satisfaction. That evening, she summoned Catherine to her office. The inspection went well. "I appreciate your loyalty, Catherine." Catherine nodded. "However, I've decided to make staffing changes. Financial constraints require reducing costs. I'll need to let you go. 2 weeks severance, effective immediately." Catherine's stomach dropped. "You're dismissing me. Economic necessity. I'm sure you understand." Catherine understood perfectly. Dr. Winterbourne was eliminating her now that the inspection had passed. "You'll vacate your cottage by the end of the month." Catherine left in a daze. She had sacrificed her integrity, lied to the inspectors, and gained nothing. Dr. Winterbourne was untouchable. She returned to her cottage and stared at the trunk containing her documentation. All that work, all that risk, for nothing. She considered going back to the inspectors, but they had already closed the case. They would be unlikely to revisit based on claims from a recently dismissed nurse with obvious resentment. Catherine spent the next 2 weeks packing. On her final day at Winterbourne, she walked through the building one last time. It felt haunted by the people who had been erased from it. Catherine left Winterbourne on March 31, 1896. She moved to Springfield, found work at a hospital, tried to build a new life. But she never stopped thinking about the families, never stopped carrying the guilt of her silence. At the farmhouse, life continued in isolation. By spring 1897, 3 more children had been born. The population now included 12 adults and 10 children, ranging from newborns to 4 years old. The children grew up knowing nothing but the farmhouse. They had never been to a town, had never seen other children, had never attended school or church. Helena taught them to read using books she brought. She taught them arithmetic. She told them the outside world was dangerous, that they needed to stay where they were safe. The children believed her. The adults had long since stopped resisting. Helena documented everything: growth rates, developmental milestones, tuberculosis resistance across 2 generations. She was building toward her ultimate experiment, when these children reached reproductive age and produced the 2nd generation. Only 7 more years, she calculated. By 1904, the oldest would be 13 or 14. She was patient. She had time. But in November 1897, something happened that threatened everything. Samuel Cobb appeared at Winterbourne in the middle of the night, hammering on the door. Helena answered, still in her nightgown. "Dr. Winterbourne, you need to come. There's been an incident." "What kind of incident?" "3 of them tried to escape. 2 adults and 1 of the older children. They got past me, made it almost 2 miles before I tracked them down. Helena's blood went cold. Where are they now? Locked in the barn. But one is hurt. The man fell during the chase. His leg is broken. Helena dressed quickly. She rode with Cobb through the dark to the farmhouse, mind racing. She found Giuseppe Rossi, Maria, and Antonio locked in the barn. Giuseppe was lying on the ground, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. Maria sat beside him, crying. Antonio, now 3 years old, huddled against his mother, eyes huge with terror. Helena examined Giuseppe's leg. Compound fracture of the tibia. Bone visible through torn skin. How did this happen? They tried to climb the fence. The man made it over but fell wrong. Helena looked at Maria. Why did you try to escape? You know you're protected here. Maria's voice was hoarse. We cannot live like this anymore. We are not animals. We want our son to have a real life. This is a real life. This is safety. This is prison. Helena stood, brushing dirt from her skirt. Giuseppe needs surgery, and because of this incident, I'll need stronger security measures. She turned to Cobb. Build a higher fence. Increase patrols. No more escapes. Helena treated Giuseppe's leg in the barn, setting the bone while he screamed, and Maria held him down. She administered morphine, sutured the wound, splinted the leg. But infection set in within days. By December, Giuseppe was feverish and delirious. By Christmas, gangrene had spread. Helena amputated below the knee on December 28, 1897. Giuseppe survived but never fully recovered. He remained weak and depressed. The escape attempt broke the spirit of everyone at the farmhouse. No one tried to run after that. Helena documented Giuseppe's case. Subject A2, negative outcome following escape attempt. Amputation required. Subject remains viable for observation but no longer suitable for active protocols. She continued her visits through 1898. The population stabilized. More children were born. The first-generation subjects grew older. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Then, in October 1898, Helena received troubling news. A letter arrived from Dr. Robert Chen, newly appointed state health inspector for Western Massachusetts. He had been reviewing old complaint files and found the 1895 complaint against Winterbourne. He found the resolution unsatisfactory and wished to conduct a new, more thorough inspection. Helena read the letter with alarm. This Chen was more persistent than previous inspectors. He specifically mentioned interviewing former staff members, which meant Catherine Morris. Helena composed a polite response, requesting advance notice to prepare documentation. But Chen's return letter indicated he would arrive on November 15, 1898, with or without cooperation. He had legal authority to inspect any facility at any time. Helena had 3 weeks. She spent a week reviewing every document. She burned sections of patient files. She rewrote discharge summaries. She created completely fabricated records showing normal operations. But one problem remained. If Chen interviewed Catherine Morris, he might hear things that contradicted official records. Helena began with subtle sabotage. She wrote to Catherine's hospital administrator, expressing concern that the former nurse had left Winterbourne under questionable circumstances, suggesting instability, planting seeds of doubt about Catherine's reliability. But Helena needed more permanent solutions. On November 3, 1898, Helena traveled to Springfield. She brought a bottle of patent medicine containing significant arsenic, purchased under a false name. She went to City Hospital and asked to speak with Nurse Morris, claiming an employment reference question. Catherine agreed to meet in a private office. When she saw Helena, her face went pale. "Dr. Winterbourne, what are you doing here?" Helena's voice was calm, measured. "An inspector is coming to Winterbourne in 2 weeks. A very thorough inspector. If he speaks with you, if you tell him what you know, it will cause problems. I can't allow that. I'll tell him the truth. I should have told the first inspectors. If you do, I'll destroy you. I've already contacted your employers, suggested you're unstable. One word from me and you'll lose this position. Catherine's hands clenched. I don't care. Those families deserve to be free. They're contributing to medical science that could save thousands of lives. You're experimenting on children. That's not science. It's evil. Helena's eyes went cold. Your cooperation or your destruction, Catherine. Those are your options. Catherine turned and ran from the office. Helena made no attempt to stop her. She had planted enough doubt. If Catherine went to authorities now, she would sound paranoid. Catherine did go to the police. She spent 2 hours at Springfield Police Station, telling them about the imprisoned families, the experiments, the deaths. The officers listened politely but skeptically. One detective asked, "Where exactly are these families being held?" "At a farmhouse west of Pittsfield." "I don't know the exact location. Do you have physical evidence?" Catherine showed them her copied records. The detective reviewed the papers with obvious skepticism. "Miss Morris, these are just patient records. I don't see evidence of any crime here. The crime is the imprisonment, but you don't know where these people are supposedly held. And you have no direct evidence, just your interpretation of medical records." The detective closed the folder. "I'll note your complaint. If we receive other reports, we'll investigate. But without concrete evidence, there's nothing we can do." Catherine left in despair. That evening she sat in her room, surrounded by her documentation, and realized the horrible truth. No one would help. No one would believe her. She was powerless to stop Dr. Winterbourne. Inspector Robert Chen arrived at Winterbourne on November 15, 1898. He was a methodical man of 42, Harvard Medical School educated. He had built his career on thoroughness. Helena received him with professional courtesy. She provided sanitized records. He spent 3 days at Winterbourne, interviewing patients, touring rooms, reviewing documentation. He found nothing obviously wrong, but he felt something was off. The patients were too compliant, the records too perfect. On his final day, Chen asked directly, "Dr. Winterbourne, have you had patients who remained here for unusually extended periods? Some chronic cases stay for years, all voluntarily. Have any patients disappeared or gone missing?" "Certainly not. Patients either recover or succumb to illness. I've reviewed the 1895 complaint alleging imprisonment. Your response? False and malicious, filed by a dismissed employee. As you can see, all patients are here voluntarily." Chen made notes. "I'd like to interview that former employee." Helena provided Catherine's information, confident her accusations would only discredit her. After Chen departed, Helena felt she had passed another test. The evidence was hidden 20 miles away. Chen would never locate it, but Robert Chen was persistent. He traveled to Springfield and interviewed Catherine Morris on November 20th. He listened carefully. He reviewed her documentation. Unlike the police detective, Chen didn't dismiss her immediately. He saw the patterns. He noticed inconsistencies. He recognized her testimony was detailed and consistent. "This is very serious, Miss Morris. If accurate, Dr. Winterbourne is conducting criminal experiments. I've been trying to get someone to investigate for years. You mentioned a farmhouse. Any idea where?" "Only that it's west of Pittsfield." Chen made extensive notes. "I'll continue investigating. I'll search property records for land purchases in Dr. Winterbourne's name. If I find the farmhouse, we'll have evidence to shut down her operation." Catherine felt hope surge. "Thank you for believing me." Chen returned to Pittsfield and began researching property records. It took 3 weeks, but he found it. A farmhouse purchased September 1895 by Helena Winterbourne in Windsor Township, 22 miles west of Pittsfield. Chen made plans to visit in mid-December with a county sheriff. But before he could act, something happened. On December 6, 1898, Robert Chen fell ill. Severe stomach cramps, nausea, vomiting. He assumed food poisoning and stayed home. His condition worsened. The vomiting became severe. He developed muscle weakness and rapid heartbeat. By December 10th, he was too weak to leave bed. His wife called a physician, who diagnosed acute gastric distress of unknown origin. Rest and bland foods were prescribed. Chen continued deteriorating. On December 14th, convulsions began. On December 15th, he fell into a coma. Robert Chen died December 16th, 1898, age 42. Official cause: acute gastritis complicated by cardiac failure. No autopsy was performed. Helena Winterbourne attended Chen's funeral, expressing condolences. She sent white lilies and chrysanthemums. No one suspected she had been poisoning his morning coffee for 3 weeks, adding arsenic to the thermos he purchased daily from the same shop. Catherine Morris read about Chen's death in the newspaper. She stared at the obituary and knew with absolute certainty what had happened. Dr. Winterbourne had killed him. Catherine felt something break inside that day. Final abandonment of hope. Dr. Winterbourne was untouchable. She killed with impunity. Catherine took out her documentation one final time and added, Inspector Robert Chen investigated Winterbourne. Died December 16, 1898. Arsenic poisoning suspected but unproven. Dr. Winterbourne responsible. Then she locked the trunk. She would keep documenting. But she no longer believed anyone would see justice done. Some monsters were too clever to be caught. At the farmhouse, the imprisoned families knew nothing of Chen's investigation or death. They continued their isolated existence. The children grew older. The first generation approached adolescence. And Helena Winterbourne sat in her office, writing in her coded journal, planning futures for children who would never escape. Subject A1A, Antonio Rossi, now age 4. Development normal. Ready for advanced protocols by age 12. Subject B2A, age 5. Shows excellent resistance. Designated for pairing with subject C1 at maturity. Second generation pairing scheduled 1907. Research timeline undisturbed. The work continues. Snow fell on the Berkshire Mountains, covering the sanitarium and hidden farmhouse in white silence. Inside locked rooms, children grew up knowing nothing but imprisonment. And one woman continued her monstrous work, untouched by law or conscience, protected by isolation and the bodies of those who had tried to stop her. The autumn of 1907 brought a cold that settled early in the Berkshire Mountains, and with it came the beginning of Helena Winterbourne's most ambitious phase. Antonio Rossi was 13 years old, tall for his age, with his mother's dark hair and eyes that had learned early to show nothing. He had spent his entire life at the farmhouse in Windsor, 12 years of isolation broken only by Dr. Winterbourne's weekly visits and the constant presence of the other imprisoned families. He could read and write in 3 languages: Italian from his parents, English from Dr. Winterbourne's lessons, and French from the Bisset family who shared their captivity. He could solve complex mathematical problems. He had read every book Dr. Winterbourne brought to the farmhouse, some of them multiple times. But he had never been to a town, had never attended school, had never seen another human being beyond the 23 people imprisoned with him and the cold woman who controlled every aspect of their existence. On a gray October morning, Helena arrived at the farmhouse with her usual medical bag and something else, a leather-bound journal she carried with unusual care. She gathered all the adults in the main room, leaving the younger children upstairs under the supervision of the oldest girls. The adults sat on wooden benches, their faces bearing the marks of 12 years of imprisonment. Giuseppe with his missing leg, Maria with premature gray in her hair, Anna Kowalski's hands twisted with arthritis at 34, Thomas O'Brien's eyes permanently downcast. Helena stood before them, the journal held against her chest. You've all been patient and cooperative. Your sacrifices have contributed to important medical research. Today, we begin the next phase of that research. She opened the journal, revealing pages covered in charts and diagrams. Over the next several years, I will be arranging marriages between them. These unions have been carefully planned to maximize the hereditary resistance factors I've been documenting. Maria's voice broke the silence, hoarse from years of enforced quiet. No, you cannot. They are children. They will not be children much longer. They will be the first pairing. Maria stood, her chair scraping against the floor. I will not allow it. You have taken everything from us. You will not take this. Helena's expression didn't change. You have no choice in the matter, Maria. You never have. Giuseppe struggled to stand on his crutch. We do have a choice. We can refuse. We can tell the children to refuse. Helena closed the journal slowly. If you refuse, I will separate you. The cooperative families will remain together. The uncooperative will be sold. I have contacts in the South, plantations where laborers don't ask questions and don't come back. Would you like Antonio to spend the rest of his life cutting sugarcane in Louisiana, never knowing what happened to you? The threat hung in the air. Everyone in the room knew Helena was capable of it. They had watched her methodically eliminate every obstacle for 12 years. Maria sat back down, defeated. The marriages will take place over the next 3 years. I expect complete cooperation. The children will be told this is for their own good, for the continuation of your families. They will be told that marriage and childbearing at young ages is normal and necessary. She looked around the room. Any questions? Silence. Good. We begin in January. Helena left, locking the door behind her as always. Samuel Cobb stood guard outside, as he had for 12 years, asking no questions, seeing nothing. Inside, the adults sat in stunned, helpless silence. Then Antonio's voice came from the stairway. He had been listening. She's lying. About everything, isn't she? All the adults turned to look at him. This boy who had grown up in their cage, who had never known freedom, who was about to be forced into Helena's final experiment. Maria's face crumbled. Oh, my son, I am so sorry. Antonio came down the stairs slowly. Behind him, other children appeared. Elizabeth Bissett, 13, her face pale. James Kowalski, 12. Sarah O'Brien, 11. The children who had been raised together, who had been told they were special, protected, safe. They had all been listening. Antonio sat on the floor in front of his parents, and for the first time in his life, they told him the complete truth. They told him about the sanitarium, about the tuberculosis, about how Dr. Winterbourne had trapped them. They told him about the 3rd floor, about the escape attempt that cost Giuseppe his leg, about the prison that had moved from Winterbourne to this farmhouse. They told him about the experiments, the deliberate disease exposure, the deaths of infants who didn't show the resistance Helena was selecting for. They told him he wasn't special. He was a laboratory specimen. When they finished, Antonio sat silent for a long time. Then he said, "We have to leave. All of us. We have to escape." Giuseppe shook his head. "We tried once. You know what happened. You tried when I was 3 years old. I'm 13 now. And there are more of us. 14 children old enough to help. We outnumber Cobb. We outnumber Dr. Winterbourne. And where would we go?" Thomas O'Brien asked quietly. "We have no money, no papers. Some of us barely speak English. The children have never been outside these walls. Then we learn. We plan. We wait for the right moment." Maria took Antonio's face in her hands. "If we fail, she will separate us. Or worse, if we don't try, she'll breed us like animals, and our children will live the same life we have. Is that better?" Around the room, something shifted. The adults looked at each other, looked at their children, saw in their faces a determination that 12 years of imprisonment hadn't completely extinguished. Anna Kowalski spoke, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "What do you have in mind?" Over the winter of 1907 to 1908, the farmhouse became a place of secret preparation. The children, led by Antonio, began mapping everything: the fence line, the barn, the root cellar, the woods beyond the property. They noted when Cobb made his patrols, when he slept, when he went to town for supplies. The adults taught them everything they could remember about the outside world: what towns looked like, how money worked, what to say if questioned by authorities. It had been 12 years since most of them had been free, and their memories were fading, but they shared what they had. Elizabeth Bissett, who had her mother's talent for drawing, sketched maps based on descriptions of the road to Pittsfield. James Kowalski, good with his hands like his father, began secretly loosening boards in the barn, creating a hidden cache where they could store supplies. They moved with excruciating slowness, knowing one mistake would alert Cobb or Helena. Helena visited every Sunday, conducting her examinations, monitoring the children's development, preparing for the marriages she had planned. She noticed nothing different. The families were as compliant as they had always been. In January 1908, she announced that Antonio and Elizabeth would be married in March. She brought Elizabeth a simple white dress. She brought Antonio a suit. She told them they were fortunate to be starting families young, to be contributing to important research. Both children accepted with downcast eyes and murmured thanks. Helena saw obedience. She didn't see the rage burning behind their careful masks. The wedding was scheduled for March 15th, 1908. Helena planned to conduct the ceremony herself, as she had done with the first-generation marriages 15 years earlier. The escape was planned for March 14th. Antonio's plan was simple but dangerous. During Cobb's evening patrol, when he walked the fence line on the far side of the property, the strongest children would overpower him. They would take his keys, his rifle, and his horse. The adults and younger children would flee on foot into the woods, heading east toward Pittsfield. The older children would follow on horseback, covering their escape. It wasn't a good plan. It had 100 ways to fail, but it was the only chance they had. On the night of March 14th, a late winter storm swept through the Berkshires. Heavy snow, wind, visibility reduced to almost nothing. Perfect conditions. Cobb made his evening patrol bundled in a heavy coat, visibility limited by the snow, moving quickly to get back to his warm cottage. He didn't see Antonio and James until they were on him. The boys were 13 and 12, farm-strong from years of labor, desperate with the knowledge that this was their only chance. They hit Cobb from both sides, driving him into the snow. Cobb was a grown man, experienced in violence from his mill-working days. He threw James off, reached for the rifle on his shoulder. Antonio grabbed a rock from the frozen ground and brought it down on Cobb's head. The sound was terrible, wet and final. Cobb stopped moving. Antonio stood over him, rock still in his hand, breathing hard. He was 13 years old, and he had just killed a man. James stared at the body. Is he dead? Antonio dropped the rock and knelt, checking for breath, for a pulse. Yes. We have to go. Now. They took Cobb's keys, his rifle, his coat. They ran back to the farmhouse and opened the doors. Everyone out. Stay together. Head east. Don't stop. The families poured out into the snow. 23 people, ranging from Giuseppe at 43 to the youngest children at 5 and 6 years old. They wore every piece of clothing they owned, layered against the cold. Giuseppe moved on his crutch through the snow, Maria supporting him. Anna carried one of the youngest children. Thomas led the way with Cobb's rifle. The older children brought up the rear. Antonio on Cobb's horse, Elizabeth and James on foot, making sure no one fell behind. They disappeared into the storm, leaving the farmhouse door open and Samuel Cobb's body cooling in the snow. They walked through the night, through woods and fields, following the stars when the clouds broke, guessing when they didn't. The children, who had never walked more than 100 yards in any direction, struggled through miles of rough terrain. The adults, weakened by years of captivity, pushed beyond exhaustion. Giuseppe collapsed twice. Maria and Thomas carried him between them. One of the youngest children, a boy of 6, had to be carried on Antonio's horse. By dawn, they had covered perhaps 8 miles. Not enough. When Helena came for her Sunday visit and found Cobb dead and the farmhouse empty, she would come after them with the sheriff, with dogs, with whatever force necessary. But they kept moving. Around noon, they reached a road. A real road, with wagon ruts and evidence of regular travel. They followed it east, hoping it led to Pittsfield. They were found 3 hours later by a farmer named Henry Walsh, driving his wagon home from church. Walsh pulled his wagon to a stop and stared at the group of ragged, exhausted people emerging from the woods. Families with children. A man on a crutch. All of them looking half-frozen and terrified. "Who are you people? Where did you come from?" Antonio stepped forward. He was the tallest, the one who had taught himself to speak without an accent, the one they had agreed would be their spokesman. "We need help. We've been imprisoned, held captive for 12 years. We escaped last night. Please, we need to get to the authorities." Walsh's face showed profound skepticism. Imprisoned? By who? A woman named Dr. Helena Winterbourne. She's been conducting experiments on us. On the children. We need protection. We need to get to Pittsfield before she finds us. Walsh looked at the group more carefully. Saw the children's faces, old beyond their years. Saw Giuseppe's missing leg. Saw the desperation in all their eyes. "Get in the wagon. All of you. I'll take you to the sheriff." It took 2 trips. Walsh's wagon loaded beyond capacity, but he brought all 23 of them to Pittsfield, to the sheriff's office, where they poured out their story to a lawman who listened with increasing disbelief. Sheriff Thomas Brennan was 54 years old, a practical man who had seen many things in his career, but nothing quite like this. 23 people claiming to have been imprisoned for over a decade by a respected physician. Children who had never been to school, never been registered with any authority, who officially didn't exist. Stories of medical experiments, forced breeding programs, systematic imprisonment. It was either an elaborate delusion or the worst crime Brennan had ever encountered. He sent a deputy to the farmhouse in Windsor to investigate. The deputy returned with Samuel Cobb's body and confirmed the farmhouse showed evidence of long-term habitation by many people. Brennan sent telegrams to Boston, to the State Medical Board, to the Attorney General's office, and then he went to Winterbourne Sanitarium to arrest Dr. Helena Winterbourne. Helena was in her office when Sheriff Brennan arrived with 2 deputies on the afternoon of March 15, 1908. She received them calmly, professionally. "Sheriff Brennan, how may I help you?" "Dr. Winterbourne, I need you to come with me to Pittsfield. There are some serious allegations that require your response." "What sort of allegations?" 23 people showed up in town this morning claiming you've been holding them prisoner, conducting medical experiments. One of them killed your farmhouse overseer during their escape." Helena's face showed perfect surprise and concern. "That's absurd. I have no idea what you're talking about. You own a farmhouse in Windsor? I own several properties. Real estate investments. Did you have people living at that farmhouse?" "I may have housed some former patients there temporarily. Recovered tuberculosis cases who needed a quiet place to convalesce before returning to normal life." "For 12 years? Certainly not. A few months at most, various individuals at different times." Brennan pulled out a small notebook. "We have 23 people, including 14 children, claiming they've been imprisoned since 1896. They have very detailed stories, doctor, and they all match. Then they're all lying. Or deluded. Mass hysteria isn't uncommon in isolated groups. We also have Samuel Cobb's body. Regrettable. If he was killed during some kind of mental breakdown by disturbed former patients, that's a tragedy. But it has nothing to do with me. You're going to need to explain that to a judge. You're under arrest, Dr. Winterbourne." Helena stood slowly. "On what charge?" "Kidnapping. Unlawful imprisonment. We'll see what else after investigation. This is a mistake, Sheriff. A terrible mistake that you'll regret. We'll let the courts decide that." Brennan escorted Helena to Pittsfield in handcuffs. She maintained perfect composure the entire way. The trial of Dr. Helena Winterbourne began on June 3, 1908, in Berkshire County Superior Court. The prosecution presented 23 witnesses. Every adult and older child from the farmhouse testified. They described the sanitarium, the 3rd floor, the move to the farmhouse, the experiments, the forced isolation, the deaths. Giuseppe Rossi testified about his escape attempt and the amputation that followed. Maria testified about watching her son be raised as an experimental subject. Antonio testified about growing up in a cage, about being told the outside world was dangerous, about learning at age 13 that his entire life had been a lie. The testimony was devastating, consistent, and detailed. The defense argued that these were former tuberculosis patients who had been provided free housing and medical care, that they had stayed voluntarily, that they had become mentally unstable from their illness and were now fabricating elaborate conspiracy theories. Helena took the stand in her own defense. She was calm, articulate, sympathetic. She explained that she had been conducting a long-term study of tuberculosis recovery, that the families had agreed to participate, that she had housed them comfortably and treated them well. She produced records showing modest payments to Samuel Cobb for property management. She produced receipts for food and supplies delivered to the farmhouse. She made it all sound perfectly reasonable. The prosecution tried to introduce Helena's coded journals, seized from her office at Winterbourne, but without the cipher key, they were incomprehensible. Helena claimed they were personal diaries written in a private shorthand. Nothing sinister. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On June 28, 1908, they returned a verdict. Guilty of unlawful imprisonment. Guilty of practicing medicine without proper oversight. Guilty of child endangerment. Not guilty of kidnapping because the original admissions to the sanitarium had been voluntary. Not guilty of murder or manslaughter in the deaths of the children because cause of death couldn't be definitively proven 12 years later. Helena was sentenced to 15 years in the Massachusetts Women's Reformatory. It was, by any measure, an inadequate punishment for what she had done, but it was justice of a kind. The families scattered after the trial. Giuseppe and Maria moved to Boston with Antonio. Giuseppe found work as a clerk despite his disability. Maria took in sewing. Antonio attended school for the first time at age 14, struggling to fit in with children who had never known imprisonment. The other families went their separate ways. Some changed their names. Some moved west. All of them wanted to forget, to build new lives, to leave the nightmare behind. But the children carried it with them. Antonio would wake screaming from nightmares for years. Elizabeth Bisset would never marry, never have children, unable to separate intimacy from the forced breeding program Helena had planned. James Kowalski became a drinker, trying to drown memories he couldn't escape. The farmhouse in Windsor was burned to the ground by persons unknown in August 1908. Winterbourne Sanitarium was seized by creditors and closed. The building stood empty for years before being demolished in 1924. Catherine Morris read about the trial in the Springfield newspaper. She was 49 years old, still working as a nurse, still carrying the guilt of her silence 12 years earlier. She sent a letter to the prosecutor, offering her documentation, her testimony about what she had witnessed in 1895. But the trial was over. The verdict rendered. Her evidence was no longer needed. She kept her trunk of documents, though, added newspaper clippings about the trial, kept building her record, her testimony, her proof that she had known and tried to warn people. It was small comfort. Helena Winterbourne served her sentence at the Women's Reformatory with the same icy composure she had shown throughout the trial. She was a model prisoner, quiet, obedient, causing no trouble. She was released in 1918 after serving 10 years, her sentence reduced for good behavior. She emerged into a world transformed. The Great War was ending. Women had the vote. Modern medicine had advanced beyond anything she had practiced. She was 60 years old, her medical license permanently revoked, her reputation destroyed. She moved to a small town in western New York under an assumed name, found work as a bookkeeper, lived quietly, attracting no attention. But in October 1918, the Spanish flu arrived. The pandemic swept through America with devastating speed. In the small town where Helena lived, people began dying by the dozens. The local doctor was overwhelmed. The small hospital filled beyond capacity. Someone mentioned that the quiet bookkeeper, Mrs. Helen Winter, had medical training. Could she help? Helena found herself back in a medical setting for the first time in 10 years, not as a physician, but as a volunteer nurse, helping care for the dying. She saw the flu kill indiscriminately. Strong young men dead in days, healthy children gone in hours, no pattern, no logic, no hereditary resistance that made any difference. Everything she had believed, everything she had sacrificed so many lives to prove, was rendered meaningless by a virus that killed without regard to genetics or breeding or careful selection. Helena worked through the pandemic with mechanical efficiency, changing bedding, offering water, closing the eyes of the dead, watching her life's work proven worthless by a microscopic enemy that cared nothing for her theories. In November 1918, Helena herself contracted the flu. She was admitted to the small hospital where she had been volunteering, given a bed in a ward with 20 other patients, most of them dying. She lasted 4 days. On November the 10th, 1918, one day before the armistice that ended the Great War, Helena Winterbourne died of influenza. She was alone. No family at her bedside. No one who knew her real name or what she had done. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the town cemetery, listed in the records only as Helen Winter, age 60, bookkeeper. The families she had tortured never knew she was dead. They had scattered too far, built new lives too separate. Helena simply disappeared from their awareness. A nightmare that had finally ended but left scars that never fully healed. Antonio Rossi lived until 1967. He became a teacher, married, had 3 children of his own. He never told them about his childhood. Never spoke of Dr. Winterbourne or the farmhouse or the 12 years of imprisonment. His wife found documents after his death, newspaper clippings about the trial, a handwritten account of his escape, drawings of the farmhouse layout. She burned them all, thinking they were the delusions of a man who had occasionally seemed haunted by something he would never explain. The last survivor of the farmhouse was Sarah O'Brien, who died in 1982 at age 85. She had been 11 when they escaped, old enough to remember everything but young enough to build a life afterward. Before she died, she gave an interview to a local historian researching forgotten crimes of western Massachusetts. She described the sanitarium, the farmhouse, Dr. Winterbourne's experiments. She spoke clearly, precisely, wanting it recorded. The interview was filed in the Berkshire County Historical Society archives. Few people ever read it. Catherine Morris died in 1954 at age 95. She left her trunk of documentation to the Historical Society in Springfield. It sat unopened in their basement for 13 years before a graduate student discovered it in 1967. The student, writing a dissertation on medical ethics in early 20th century America, realized what she had found. She spent 2 years verifying Catherine's documentation against trial records, census data, property records. She published her findings in 1970. A comprehensive account of Helena Winterbourne's breeding program, supported by Catherine's meticulous documentation and trial testimony. The publication caused a brief stir in academic circles. Medical ethics professors used it as a case study. Historians of medicine cited it in papers about experimental abuses. But the general public never heard the story. It was too disturbing, too specific, too easy to dismiss as an isolated aberration rather than a symptom of deeper systemic problems. The site of Winterbourne Sanitarium is now a shopping plaza in Pittsfield. The farmhouse location in Windsor is private property, marked only by foundation stones visible in the woods if you know where to look. No memorial exists for the families who were imprisoned. No plaque acknowledges what happened. The children born into Helena's experiment, the adults who spent 12 years in captivity, the infants who died in her protocols, all of them disappeared into history. But their descendants are still alive, scattered across America, carrying genes that Helena tried to select and manipulate, living lives their ancestors could never have imagined. They don't know their history, don't know about the sanitarium or the farmhouse or the woman who tried to breed them like livestock. Perhaps that's mercy, Or perhaps it's another kind of erasure. The final victory of a system that allowed Helena Winterbourne to operate in plain sight for nearly 30 years, imprisoning and experimenting on vulnerable people, protected by her status as a physician and the isolation of her victims. The last document in Catherine Morris's trunk was a letter she wrote but never sent, addressed to no one in particular, dated 1953, 1 year before her death. It read, "I have carried this story for 58 years. I have documented everything I could. I have tried to warn people, to save the families, to stop Dr. Winterbourne. I failed in almost every way. But I want someone, someday, to know that these people existed, that they suffered, that they survived, that what happened to them was wrong. I want someone to know that I saw, and I tried, even though I failed. I want someone to remember." The letter was filed with the rest of her documents. It sits now in an archive box in a climate-controlled room, waiting for someone to read it, to care, to remember. Because the most terrifying thing about Helena Winterbourne's crimes was not that they happened. It was how easy it was for them to happen. How long they continued. How many people knew or suspected but did nothing. How close she came to never being stopped at all. And how many other monsters might still be operating in isolated places, with vulnerable populations, protected by professional credentials and the assumptions of a society that doesn't want to believe such things are possible. The farmhouse families escaped, but how many others didn't? That question has no answer. Only silence, and unmarked graves, and stories that almost disappeared entirely. Almost, but not quite.